everyone again. So just introducing our amazing speakers who've been generous enough to dedicate their morning, especially on a Monday, which is great, to come talk to us about the wonderful work that they're doing. So we have Ms. Telda and we have David Kode. I'm just going to give you a brief bio of our speaker. So David is a Cameroonian national who joined CIVICUS as a policy analyst in the Secretary General's office in October 2007. He was later appointed as a program support officer and secretariat for the CIVICUS Affinity Group of National Associations. He now serves as a policy officer with the Policy and Research Unit. Prior to joining CIVICUS, he worked with UNICEF South Africa and the Office of the Deputy Representative. David holds a bachelor's degree in history and political science from the University of Bue in Cameroon and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He is currently a doctoral candidate at the Center for Africa's International Relations at the University of Witwatersrand. His thesis focuses on the political economy of post-conflict transitions in West Africa, with Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone as case studies. His other research interests include civil society and conflict resolution, Africa's international relations, international organizations, strategic studies, and diplomacy and negotiation. Round of applause. So I know, just before, I know your bio isn't in here, so yes, it's fine. I would like you to bless us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Hello, guys. I'm not David, as you can see. But I do work with David at CIVICUS. So I'm sure you've heard David's very lovely bio. So I'm sure like all Africa's big men, there will be someone to speak first before him, and then he will come and do his presentation. So anyone here who works for civil society? For any civil society organization? Yeah? What do you do? Or what your organization does?
Actually, I'm the co-founder and chairperson of the Youth Development Organization.
Okay.
It's a youth-based organization that we provide tutor, mentoring, coaching, different sport codes. The idea is just to keep the young ones out of the street.
Oh wow, amazing. Okay, and where are you based?
Pretoria.
In Pretoria. Okay. There was another hand? Yes?
I just recently joined or is looking for African Dance Program. So we deal with, but we just opened a new thing for women, so it's African Diaspora for women as well. So we're integrating this whole feminist thingy and, getting working with different women, telling them where they stand, what they should do, how they should work, and stuff like that.
Oh wow, amazing.
So
Okay.
it's based on the CBD, mostly, that they're moving all the environment and stuff like that.
Okay. All right, that's amazing. So we're in good company. Yeah. Okay, so my name is Telda, and I also work in CIVICUS under the Policy and Research Department. So if you want to know more about what we do, you can come and see me later. I'm just going to introduce a little bit about CIVICUS. Some of you might know it, some of you might not know who CIVICUS is, what we do, and then David is going to do the rest. So David will do the innovations in other countries, comparisons between civil society movements abroad and South Africa, and the most important part, I think, which is the effective way that civil society holds governments to account. Okay, so briefly on who we are, CIVICUS. So that's who we are. We were created in 1993. We're a global alliance of civil society organizations, and those are some of the things that we aim to do. So CIVICUS is a membership-based network. So either individuals can become members of CIVICUS, or civil society organizations can also become members of CIVICUS. Those are our figures currently from our membership network of about 2,100, and we have partners in over 160 countries. So our work is global. Although we do mainly focus on the global south, but our work is mostly global. I see that the room is very young, right? Which is awesome, because I think this is where Africa is going. So of our membership, more than 25%, at least for now, of our members can be classified as youth, I think. And then we also partner, we just don't partner the big Amnesties and Human Rights Watch, but we partner even the smallest of the small, the individual protesters, and even the smallest organizations. In terms of membership, I just want to mention that our membership is not purely based on the availability of the ability of the individual or the organization to pay the membership fees. So where the organization or the individual cannot afford, because resources is a big constraint in the global south. So where they cannot afford to pay, we do waiver fees, and we do have other sorts of memberships that they can be part of without having to part with money always. Sorry, just to go back to the last point where I said that we partner with even the small ones and even the big ones. Johannesburg is our base here in the global south, but we also have offices at the United Nations in Geneva, in New York, and we have other staff members who are working in other various locations, such as in South America, so that at least we can try and have that global overview. So these are the 3 strategic priorities that drive CIVICUS. First of all, we want civil society to influence decisions which will define our common future. Secondly, we seek to connect. We want stronger and better supported links between different sources of citizen action. We'll talk more about the strategic priorities and how we try and achieve those priorities. And lastly, we seek to enable. We want the best possible conditions for civil society to do our work. We'll speak more about this, but I'm sure everyone knows, right? When I say civil society and civic space, what I'm talking about, right? Okay, cool. So here's how we do it, how we achieve those strategic priorities. So first of all, we engage in a lot of research and analysis. I think one of the downfalls of civil society maybe in the past has been the lack of well-documented research, good collection of figures, reports, and so forth. So this is one of the things that we are strong in. So I'll just give you a few examples. Every year, this is just the executive summary. CIVICUS produces this. It's the State of the Civil Society report. It's a global report. I'll leave some copies and they can be passed around later. So it's like a survey that we try and do on what is the state of civil society globally, where are we, what are the trends that we're seeing in the different regions and so forth. Excuse me. Other projects that we do to try and achieve the strategic priorities is that every month we produce something that we call Civil Society Watch Bulletin. So we're always watching civil society space in all countries where possible. So in this bulletin we document violations in civil space. If someone is arrested in a protest, we document that. If an LGBTI group, lesbians, gays, is violated for protesting or for trying to get their message out, which is freedom of expression, or trying to assemble, we document that. If these are just examples. If the house of a human rights activist is bombed, these are in extreme cases, or assassinations and so forth, we document this monthly in a bulletin. You are welcome to visit our website. The bulletin is always there, and if you also want to receive it on email every month, this is also possible. Annually, we also, in addition to this, we'll also do a civil society review also. So I can tell you that for now, according to preliminary findings, we are finding that of all countries, at least in the past year, at least 100 countries have significantly violated civic space. In the previous year, it was 96. So we are up to 100. So we can see that the situation is worsening for a lot of countries. And by violations, we mean either it can be violating freedom of expression, of association, of assembly, and we see that the trends are going in terms of legal restrictions. So sometimes laws that are being passed directly to affect civil society, or sometimes laws that are being passed in the name of terrorism, right? But then they affect your ability to assemble, your freedom to protest. Sometimes terrorism is being used as a front to curb civil society. There's a lot of that. But anyway, that review will come out a bit later, and those are just preliminary findings for now. Another big project of how we do it under research and analysis that CIVICUS is engaging in, and we hope to launch it later this year, is going to be called the Civic Space Monitor. So the Civic Space Monitor is going to be a rating of all 193 United Nations member countries, where we rate the civic space in those countries using certain tools and certain methodologies. So we're going to have 5 ratings. Either a country will be rated as open, narrow, obstructed, repressed, or closed. There'll be something on every single country. And it's not going to be like a big annual report like this, where we say that we have this report, but it's documentation on an ongoing basis on every country. So if you want to know at any point how your country is doing, or a certain country of interest is doing, you'll be able to visit that website a little later in the year, in the second half, I hope. Please let me know how I'm doing on time. Okay, and then we also have a project that we are engaged in that's called Data Shift. So with Data Shift, we try and build the capacity of various NGOs to be able to generate and collect citizen-generated data that can be used in various ways, monitoring development, in campaigns, and in ETC. Because sometimes we'll find with CSOs and with protests that maybe people know the issues that they're talking about, but they don't know the data sometimes, right? Which is sometimes a downfall, and it's a big problem in those things being seen through whatever it is that they're demanding. And sometimes the data is there, it's just not collected, it's just not put in a usable format, so this is what Data Shift seeks to do. I think I've gone ahead of myself. Okay, so we also do a lot of communication work at CIVICUS. Sorry, just a second. Okay, we do a lot of communication work. Most of our comms work now is on Twitter. I think that's just the way of the new world. People still go to our website for the big reports and things like that, but a lot of things happen on Twitter. Last year, for the period 2014 to 15, we reached about 12 million people on Twitter. So, you know, it's the way of the new world. There's no way of avoiding it, and it's the way that the youth, we are speaking to each other, and that's one of the things that we do. CIVICUS also has a lot of convening and network engagements. So, I mean, there's so much that CIVICUS does. These are just examples. As one of the network engagements that we do, every year we host the International Civil Society Week. Some of you might have heard about it, some of you maybe not. For the first time, we hosted it in Johannesburg last year, where over 700 civil society members came together for a week spanning about 40 events. So what happens with ICSW is that that week, that International Civil Society Week, is that civil society come together, they share ideas, and it's also just a celebration of civil society, because I think civil society always is working under difficult conditions, is repressed. Sometimes there isn't that opportunity to just pause and just celebrate. So that's what also happens there. At the next International Civil Society Week that will be held in Bogota, in Colombia, in April. So, if you are a member of CIVICUS, there's benefits, and this is one of the benefits that you come together with other civil society organizations, not just travel, and and you share ideas, what's working in your country, what's not working, how have you overcome these problems, and so forth. Civicus also has what it calls the AGNA network, which is the Affinity Group of National Associations. So let's say here in South Africa, all civil society members perhaps fall under a certain umbrella body. So all countries have those umbrella bodies of civil society organizations. Civicus convenes a global forum of all these umbrella bodies where they also come together, they engage, they share ideas, what's going on in their regions, how have they overcome certain legal obstacles, and so forth. And that network just goes on and on in their different countries. Advocacy and lobbying, there's a lot that happens under there. Civicus, one of the things that it does is that sometimes where funds are available and possible, we carry out solidarity missions to places that are difficult, places that are restrained, but where we are obviously able to go. So say Uganda recently passed an NGO bill that is very restrictive of civic space there in Uganda. Civicus carried out a solidarity mission to there. The purpose is that not just to show solidarity with civil society there, but to highlight internationally, because Civicus does have that international clout, if you like. So to highlight internationally what's going on, what's the problem with that law, and to also try and pressure, if it's the government that needs pressuring to change this law or to amend it before it is passed, and so forth. We also have, if you go to our website, what we call a Civil Society Behind Bars campaign. So there's so many civil society leaders and activists who are imprisoned, threatened, under difficult conditions the world over. The Civil Society Behind Bars campaign focuses on those who are behind bars, as it says. So what we try and do is that we engage with the families and the organizations of those people who have been arrested. We bring their cases to this campaign. We try and campaign for the release of these people. Sometimes they can include journalists. We do cover journalists because the United Nations definition of human rights defenders is very wide, and it includes, for example, journalists as well. So if they are threatened, or if they are arrested, we try and campaign for those things on an ongoing basis. I'll explain a bit later how we also do that. And lastly, under advocacy and lobbying, we have a small sub-grant system that we call Lifeline. Lifeline is for civil society organizations that are really in distress. It's not a lot of money, it's very little that we're able to make a grant if there's something that they want to do immediately in threatened environments in a way that can enable us to do it, but still protecting them, their identity. If they need that protection, we are sometimes able to do that. These are just a few recent highlights of the year 2014-2015 of what Civicus has done. So we've supported that number of civil society representatives to go to the United Nations. Okay, so why it's important to go to the United Nations? Every government has got the money and the resources that can afford it to take itself to the United Nations and defend itself and present its own stance there. Civil society doesn't always have those sort of resources. Every 4 years, I'll just explain briefly that because everyone might not be familiar with the Universal Periodic Review. Every 4 years, every country that is a member of the United Nations goes under a human rights review at the United Nations. So it's mandatory for every country that's a member to appear before the United Nations and explain what has been going on in terms of the human rights situation in their countries. According to the last review, which would have happened the last 4 years ago, have they taken the recommendations? What steps have they taken? But governments are not obliged to accept all the recommendations. So they can accept some, sometimes they say no to some. So because government has got the money, it can collect all this information and say we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, but sometimes government is economical with the truth, as we know. So, so it therefore means that, you know, it's up to civil society to be able to group, to lobby, to advocate there at the United Nations, in Geneva or in New York, when each country comes up for the Universal Periodic Review. Civil society also has an opportunity to go and present its own reports, right, of what has happened and recommendations of what it thinks should better happen. So this is where CIVICUS comes in. We make those periodic review submissions, those reports as well, per country. So we partner with different civil society organizations, maybe yourselves, in all the countries, obviously, so that it's legitimate with people on the ground, and we submit that to the United Nations. When the period for review comes up now, there at the United Nations, the United Nations allows civil society representatives. So sometimes even people who were tortured, who were harassed, who were beaten, who were violated, to be able to come before the United Nations themselves and present their own stories. Because, I mean, government will always have its own side. The authorities will always have their own side. And they're also allowed to make their own reports. Sometimes they will have done well. Often, maybe they will have changed laws, they would have amended them. They come, they present that. Civil society comes, it either agrees or it says it doesn't agree, and it can say that this is where we think things can still be done better. Last year we organized that, the Global Day of Citizen Action. You can go to the website and see more about it, but it was about 115 events in 52 countries that were done by different organizations and individuals as well, but under that Global Day of Citizen Action. I've mentioned this already, that the International Civil Society Week, we had the first one in Johannesburg. We always seek to host that week in the Global South. And at least, but when I say the Global South, it doesn't mean that the Global North does not violate civic space. We are seeing a lot of that. For example, now we are seeing with France and with Turkey, with Poland, that there's a lot of these laws that I was talking about. Laws on terror, emergency laws that are violating people's rights to assemble, to protest, people just getting searched without warrants and so forth. So it doesn't mean that the Global North is not complicit in violating people's rights. And where they do violate, we also document. And 30% of the participants at the ICSW were individuals who were under 30. And we hope that for the next ICSW, it's something that can be increased. Okay, that was a lot. Do we do questions now? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Could you please expand on the Lifeline grant and possibly give case examples of how it's distributed, and is it a conditional grant based on certain objectives being met, and yeah.
Okay, so like I said, it's a small grant, right? It's not that big. So what would happen is that if you are an organization, maybe you are threatened, you just need that little lifeline, you want to do an advocacy program in your country, we don't identify you. You have to come to CIVICUS. Sometimes you can be identified through another partner of ours or through the umbrella bodies, association, maybe if you fall under the umbrella, maybe they might identify you, right, to say so-and-so needs this. So you come and you go through the application process, right? So there are certain conditions, obviously, that you have to fulfill. We want transparency, obviously, if you're going to be getting funding, to show how you're going to use it. We want to know what is going to be the impact, obviously, of that if you go ahead with it. Yeah, I think basically that's it. So you go through the application process with us. You can find more details on the website. And then if it works out, you know, the little grant comes through and you're able to do that work. Do I answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Her and then, yeah.
So does this Lifeline program only go to an NGO or does it also go to individuals? And the reason I want to say this is because last year, the African Union released Agenda 2063. So I have a society on campus which was very passionate and kind of against the way in which the African Union did this regarding the youth clause. You see, they did not consult any African youth before they drew it up, and therefore there was an opportunity to go to Ethiopia and lobby it with, you know, documents, etc. Obviously that needs funding. So if someone wanted to have, like, go to Ethiopia, I know it's passed now, but could they have applied through the same process? But it's not a society, sorry, it's not an NGO, it would have just been one individual.
Okay, it will depend with the individual, because usually the individual, sometimes we can have individual protests, right? One-man protests or something like that. That one would be quite tricky, I would say, because, you know, you would need to go through a lot of vetting and interview processing, and you are not really under threat. You want to lobby and advocate. So if we weigh you against the other applications that we receive, chances of that sort of application by an individual succeeding, I think are limited. Yeah. Yes. Her, and then I'll come to you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. When it comes to the UN, in terms of the representatives, wouldn't it be, doesn't it occur that there's some conflicts between the country representing itself and the civil society representing, whereby in turn it will bring the problem to the civils in that particular country?
Okay, yeah. So we see a lot of this during the Universal Periodic Review submissions at the UN, that especially in countries that are not welcoming of civil society activities, right? Let's take Burundi right now. At the moment, it's difficult for anyone in civil society to speak out, and they've clamped down on civil society, and those that are operating are mostly operating from outside the country. The safety of the activists for CIVICUS always comes first, always. So we try not to jeopardize. So in some cases, some activists can come out and speak. So maybe say in the case of Zimbabwe, it's a semi-free environment. So they can come. They do have a little bit of risk, right, of being repressed when they go back home. But civil society there is generally organized, and they are allowed to operate to some extent. So in some cases, what we do is that sometimes it can be activists who are in exile who come and speak out. Sometimes it can be, sometimes those who have been arrested before are so fearless that they say, okay, I've got nothing to lose, I can do this again. But in some cases, it's actually not possible to get anyone from that country to come and speak out because it's difficult. What CIVICUS tries to do is that during the submissions, we also try and do side events at the Human Rights Council, because the submissions are made at the Human Rights Council. So at those side events, we can, sometimes, let's say if it's Southern Africa, sometimes someone from South Africa might know and might be willing to speak, or maybe has been to Zimbabwe. And when we do host the side event, perhaps they can come and, you know, and speak out. But you're totally right. There are countries where it's absolutely difficult to get someone from civil society to come without endangering their lives.
Can I just?
Yes. Yeah.
I think this is a very important point, because there are times when we have activists in Geneva and the government publicly says that there are traitors in Geneva and we're waiting for them to come back home.
Yeah.
One of the most, Telda made mention of side events. I like to go to Geneva because one of the most interesting side events we have are side events involving countries like Ethiopia. So when you have a side event, you have activists from Ethiopia, you have the diplomats as well, because they are interested in defending the state. So it is very engaging. You see direct attacks between the diplomats and the activists. But for us, it's quite engaging because now you get both sides of the same of the story. The third thing is when activists get to Geneva, our office there tries to organize meetings with diplomats. So, for example, it's difficult for an activist from Burundi to engage with a diplomat from Burundi, from his own country, because the representative there is basically an extension of the country, and they defend their policies. So what we do is that we, for example, as the activists, we organize meetings between them and EU diplomats, between them and US diplomats, between them and Dutch diplomats, countries that can either impose sanctions. But then it comes to those review submissions. What they do is that they, based on those meetings, then they get a sense of how difficult it is for activists. And that's why they have recommendations that they propose to the government on ways to improve the human rights. But I like the question.
Yeah, no, it's a good
touches
question.
on what we're
Yeah.
doing.
Mm.
So I'm just very interested in your work, particularly around LGBTQIP+ issues. Because I'm also very passionate about upholding the rights of the LGBTI community, and I feel like it's an aspect of human rights that often goes ignored in terms of what society actually does in terms of questioning and antagonizing laws which are passed against members of the LGBTI community. So I'm just trying to understand, because there is significant research in terms of how anti-LGBTI laws or even practices, even in countries like South Africa, where you have LGBTI people who are protected by the Constitution, but that doesn't really necessarily filter down in terms of like public spaces like your schools, your offices, where people still get very much marginalized. So I'm trying to understand like how you would navigate the space in terms of going into a country like Uganda, for example, where people are put in jail, people are necklaced, and people are killed just for being, part of the LGBTI community. So as a civil society organization, how do you navigate that space when there's an imposed law which directly opposes your work? And should you partake in that, or should you even be considered as somebody who associates with anyone who's deemed to be part of the LGBTI community, then you will be jailed or even killed. So how do you navigate that space in terms of reconciling your passion and your work towards upholding human rights, but also bearing in mind that there are laws which are actively against your work?
Okay, it's very difficult. That's for sure, to go into those environments, especially where it is legalized. Just as equally as it is also difficult sometimes to go into environments where the law seems favorable on paper in the Constitution, but it's something else, like in practice, like you say, maybe even like for people to access health services because they're LGBTI. What we try and do is that we try and find members on the ground. I think like we do with a lot of our work, that we try and find members on the ground. But obviously, like I said, the safety of those people always comes first. So sometimes where they want to remain anonymous, right, but want to engage with us and provide certain information, or they need our support and so forth, we're willing and we are able to do that. Although the problem is that that sort of engagement sometimes maybe is not very effective for them at home. It might be effective on the international scene to bring attention that country such and such is still violating those rights, but there at home it sometimes maybe is not that effective. Although if it can be that internationally, then there can be pressure on if it's a government or if it's an authority to say this has to change and so forth. But it's difficult, especially where it is legislated, because I think one of the last things that CIVICUS wants is for activists to be endangered or imprisoned just because we are pressuring them for that information to say let's take it to the UN. So their safety always comes first. So you always have to weigh your options and see which is the best way of doing it. Sometimes militancy doesn't always bring about the required results as quickly and as fast as you may want to. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning, my brother.
What is CIVICUS? Is it an acronym? And what does it mean?
David, do you want to?
It's very, we get asked this question every time. It's not an acronym per se. It's actually a Latin word that means convening, bringing people together. So perhaps in 1993, a group of activists sat down and said they conceived the idea of having a group of people together that would defend the rights of others, that would speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. So that is a Latin word that it means bringing people together. Then the idea evolved into an organization.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. You were saying a group of people came together so that they can represent the masses.
Yes.
So I find it problematic when she says there are reports that needs to go to the UK, to Europe. Why do we as Africans, do we have to take our dirty laundries to the European countries?
Okay.
Don't we have people in Africa who can, because this is our crisis, we need to sort it in an African way. Yeah.
Okay, can I just say something briefly on that? Okay, when I say the report is going to the UK or to Europe, I don't mean it's going to David Cameron or to Obama specifically. Unfortunately, one of the things is that the United Nations is based in Geneva and also it has offices in New York. This is something that we as Africans are talking about, have to talk about, and it's an ongoing conversation. Maybe I also didn't mention that we also do engagements at the African Union. So we are very involved with the African Union's Commission on People's and Human Rights. But when we go to New York, we are not going to Obama. We are going to the United Nations, and it's something we are going to the United Nations. We are not going to Europe per se. So if the United Nations, let's say the Mugabe's movement, Robert Mugabe's movement, to have the United Nations moved from New York to Addis or wherever else, and it was taken there, we would go there. So that's like a whole separate conversation. But for now, we are going to the United Nations. But I know where you're coming from.
I think
Yeah.
I'm itching to respond.
Yes, I know you're itching.
Maybe I should take off my hat as an activist, right? So remember, she started by saying we are a global alliance. So we don't make a distinction between, if an activist in the UK is threatened, we don't care whether he's white or black or whatever. The fact is an activist is threatened. Now, I think I understand where you're coming from, and it's always good for us as Africans to provide African solutions to African problems. Here's the challenge. If you look at debates around the International Criminal Court and the fact that it's only Africans who are persecuted, the challenge there is, and that speaks about the problems we face as Africans, you need to ratify the Rome Statute to have your citizens persecuted by the ICC, right? Who forced a president to ratify the Rome Statute? Nobody. They did that on their own accord. The US has said they will not ratify because it will persecute their citizens. Now, because our leaders want aid from European countries, because African leaders want aid, now they ratify the Rome Statute. And then it comes back to bite them, because the law is the law. So now we complain that the ICC focuses on Africans only. There are about 7 or 8 African countries whose leaders are currently being persecuted or are currently being persecuted. Of the 8, 5 of them were recommended by Africans themselves. Roland Gbagbo from Kode is being persecuted. He was recommended by Alassane Ouattara. Joseph Kony is under investigation. He was recommended by Museveni. Who else? There's this guy, Kabemba from the DRC, who was recommended by. So our leaders are playing the game with us. And we would like such problems to be solved at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. But then when the African Commission makes a judgment, African leaders do not they don't take it seriously. Why? Because those judgments are not enforceable by the African Commission. Lastly, just take a very interesting example with the public protector in South Africa. You appoint her and you give her the powers to investigate, and when she uses those powers, then it becomes a problem. That's exactly the kind of challenge we face. I personally would want to see African solutions, because nobody understands African problems the way Africans do. But then when those avenues are closed, we have no choice but to go back to sometimes the donors. In Burundi at the moment, you'd be shocked to know that if you just speak out and say you don't want Nkurunziza to stand for another term, you are basically killed. So the leaders don't even have respect for the lives of their own citizens. You force your own citizens now to go out and look for solutions elsewhere. But as a global community, as a global alliance, we try to look at solutions from wherever, as long as we can get those solutions, for the sake of one life. I don't know if that...
Okay, can I just take 2 more, then we can close this one, right?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for that. You mentioned member funding, like a membership fee, and that's how you guys run. Do you have other sources of funding, and how much are the membership fees, and how are you guys viable? That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, so like I said, the membership fees, right? It's about $50. For organizations. Yeah, and I've also brought with me the annual report from last year, 2014-2015. I'll distribute it, and you can also have a look. But if you go to civicus.org/membership, you can see that. But we do get funding from other organizations. They are listed also there in the report. We do get funding from Europe as well, so we'll be open about that. From CEDA, we do get from Danida. We have Ford Foundation. We've gotten a little from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well. But they're listed. We are very open about it. So they're in the annual report. Towards the end of the report, you can see a list of our funders.
And they just give you the funds and without a mandate or anything, or do they have a particular mandate from that?
They have a very stringent mandate, right? We need to, if you look at if you listen to the funding, the sources of funding, CEDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, the Swedish, the Danes, they don't really place conditions on how you have to work. They don't tell you what you have to do. Or from Ford Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, they allow us to carry out our mandate. Now we have a challenge with grappling with the issue where we have lots of funds coming from US aid. We're asking ourselves, should we accept and should we take it to the next level? Of course, I would want to accept because I will have our salaries paid. But then, now it's a matter of, do we compromise our principles? Because US aid will tell you from top to bottom
what to do. Yeah.
What to do. So we try to receive funding from organizations that just allow us to carry out a mandate. But then that also comes with a lot of responsibility, transparency.
We must account,
reporting.
obviously, yeah.
We must account for every cent. Now, with the membership fees, I think that is just a very tiny percentage of how we run the organization, because we have opened up our membership to having members who don't pay membership, free membership. So we have individuals, organizations, big organizations. Now the membership fee, like she said, is in the way it's structured, it's in the annual report. So it depends also, your organization that deals with you would most likely give you free membership, and I invite you now to be a member of CIVICUS. I'll give you my card, let's communicate after this. We'll give you free membership. The refugee, the African Diaspora Forum would likely grant them free membership. But if you have an organization like Action Aid or the Institute for Security Studies, would have the membership fee based on their annual income. So that's from $50 for small organizations to like $3,000 for very big organizations. But the membership fee is just a token, and we don't depend on the membership fee to run the organization. We depend on donors and funders.
Oh, okay, the two last ones. There, right? You want it? No. Okay, so this is the last one? You had your hand up?
Don't you already have I did it so many times, but like I'm covered and then
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. So you don't want the opportunity anymore?
We're not done after this round.
No, David is going to come. I'm just like the teaser, the introduction.
David, a question.
Yeah.
David, when it comes to the Ethiopia, I'm married to Ethiopian guy,
Okay.
and he was telling me how it's so hard to like have a say. Like you know how we have comedians here make jokes about Zuma and Julia, politicians and stuff, and like there you can't even say anything about it. And if you do, then your families are executed and like. So then what happens to you then? If you do want to change a few policies and stuff like that, and if you do want to like open up your own political party, then what happens to you then?
You are targeted by the authorities.
And is that, can you guys not do anything about that?
Well, one of the most successful cases of CIVICUS is, I don't know if you've heard of Netsane Bilal. He's currently head of the Africa section at Amnesty International. So remember, repression in Ethiopia really took another 10 during the 2008 elections. So everybody that spoke about the elections, that they were rigged, which they were, was locked up. Netsanet was locked up because he spoke about the elections. He talked about the fact that the elections were rigged. And he was locked up for like 4 or 5 years. Then we took on the case and we were there on a regular basis. Our CEO then would go and speak to the Ethiopian government, and he was eventually released and actually got a job with CIVICUS. So in that case, we're able to fight for his release. But we have this journalist at the moment. I'm just trying to remember his name.
Veteran.
No, Nasty Tega something.
Okay.
So he is an Ethiopian American, and he's in Ethiopia writing about human rights violations with his wife. Now, what you're saying, he gets the attention of the Ethiopian government. They lock him up, they lock his wife up with him. The wife has a baby in jail. Now, it's either you decide to sacrifice your freedom for the sake of human rights, for the love of your country, or you just stay quiet and then you allow the government to do what it does. Now, we work with a lot of Ethiopian activists, and every one of them that we take to Geneva comes from exile. Most of them are not based in Ethiopia. It's a very repressive regime. Even when we go there as activists, we are very conscious about our communication because the government monitors most of those things.
And is there nothing that can be done against the government if they don't know or anything against the government?
Can I just
be like that?
Okay, with Ethiopia, one of the difficulties you'll find is that sometimes, as with repressive states, that the states that are powerful sometimes and have the economic muscle sometimes to force the government to do something, sometimes are unwilling to, because they are benefiting something economically from that country. And this is the case of Ethiopia. So you'll see that from last year, from December last year, there's the case of a region called Oromia in Ethiopia. Yeah, people there have, students there started, and then everyone joined protesting against a proposed economic zone. So the government wanted to expand Addis Ababa and expand it into this area called Oromia, and people would lose their land there. So people started protesting and so forth. The government just clamped down on them, and is still clamping down on them. Since December to now, about 150 people have died during the protests, like being shot, being beaten, being killed. And the difficulty we faced lobbying about Ethiopia internationally concerning Oromia especially is that the United States is quiet about Ethiopia because there is something to benefit economically from Ethiopia. So sometimes, you know, the West is very hypocritical. Where there is something to eat, for them to eat, they will just look the other side as if nothing is happening. And it becomes very difficult for people who are there and for us in our lobbying as well, because, you know, sometimes our lobbying sort of goes to waste, as it were, because sometimes the only thing that can make these people, like these leaders, wake up is the threat of some loss of something economic. And in cases where like those big powers are in bed with them, you know, you're screwed. Like if you're there in Ethiopia, you're on your own. Yeah. It's very horrible. Ethiopia is one of the most repressive. Yeah. There's no criticism. I think we actually did a lobby when they wanted to shut the last human rights organization there. They're there, they're still existing, but they do very...
It's like one person now.
It's like one person.
We actually took the case to the African Commission,
Yeah.
and we are fighting for them not to. It's the last independent NGO that focuses on human rights.
That
So
is
it's
in
just
Ethiopia.
like one individual in the office, and it's not doing much, but they want to completely close it down.
Sure. So,
Yes,
so
Lebo.
that was my question, right? Is that because as an organization that works with other civil society organizations, my question was, are there then those civil society organizations that are actually pushing neoliberal and imperialistic agendas through the guise of civil society activism? And what is then Civicus relationship, like the relationship between Civicus and those NGO organizations that sort of perpetuate sort of neoliberal and imperialist interests under the guise of aid?
That comes also to the selection of, we don't just accept any partner or any NGO, and as you know, when we look at development, we are against, you know, enforcing the neoliberal agenda on citizens and on organizations. But sometimes we don't really have that knowledge about which organization does that. And that's why from a global perspective, we are very conscious about who we accept funding from. But we can't support organizations that have another agenda. We support individuals and organizations that are under threat. And we make sure that we have the evidence before we do that. We don't work with those that are not, you know, independent and do not really have, who don't really have a good enough reason for us to support them. So it's quite difficult, but we are also at the global level trying to say citizens have the right to do what they want to do, and it's quite difficult for us to identify some of those organizations on the ground. It's not an easy job sometimes, I can assure you.
Just a suggestion, can we get to this second part?
Please.
And then
Yeah.
should there be time remaining, we can...
Yeah, then you can... She will be first, David, please. Yeah, because her hand was up for a long time, and she as well. Her, and then her. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Maybe sometimes we can just have a discussion as opposed to a presentation, right?
Yes.
Because then we learn more as opposed to us standing here and telling you, maybe giving you a few ideas. So we're asked as well to talk about civil society innovations in other countries. And this was perhaps one of the toughest assignments I've had to do. Why? Because there are so many examples to choose from. But we decided to choose one example, one project, which CIVICUS undertook last year. I know most of you are youths. Who is aware of Action 2015? No one. And can I ask, my second question would be, last year, there were 2 significant events. We'll talk about Christmas Ball later. There were 2 significant events that happened at the global level concerning all countries and all citizens. One was on development, significant, and the other on climate issues. Is there anybody that has an idea? Yes?
The Sustainable Development
The Sustainable Development Goals, yeah? COP 21. So these are 2 major events that had a bearing on all of us as citizens, or that would have. For the Sustainable Development Goals, it's about development issues for the next 15 years until 2030. You know, the Millennium Development Goals died in 2015, and now they were supposed to be taken over by Sustainable Development Goals. Then the other was, of course, agreements on how to mitigate the effects of climate change and ensure that we have a sustainable environment for us and our children. So Action 2015 was basically making sure that when our leaders went to this event, they spoke on behalf of the people. They spoke about issues that affect you and I as citizens. In 2000, when the Millennium Development Goals were conceived, it was just a group of our leaders from the Global South, especially those from the Global North, who decided, okay, let us agree on 9 goals that would benefit citizens without any consultation, without any feedback, without any input from citizens. So we decided this time that since new goals will be agreed on in September 2015, and since an opportunity presented itself for leaders to talk about what ideas they would want to have as far as climate issues are concerned, CIVICUS developed this project, Action 2015. Action 2015 was a coalition of 2,200 organizations committed to fighting injustice, poverty, inequality, and for a better future. So the project itself started on the 15th of January 2015 and ended in January 2016. There were 31 million campaigns in total in 157 countries. This was a global movement, and it was the first of its kind, targeting these 2 events and letting leaders know that the UN is accountable to citizens, leaders accountable to citizens. It was just a group of organizations from Peru to Senegal to UK to Canada to Australia that targeted specific events that we knew that leaders would focus on to pass on a message that poverty, inequality, and climate change are interlinked, and that a lot of mistakes had been made in the past, and now that you have an opportunity to agree on goals that would drive development for the next 15 years, we needed to get it right. So it was a global movement, massive in all ramifications. So what happened was that we spoke to renowned individuals like Desmond Tutu, Malala, those that, people we knew, if they speak, world leaders will listen, citizens will listen. So we spoke to them, and we drafted a letter, and they sent it to major leaders around the world about what citizens want, about avoiding the mistakes of the past. Now, between January 2015 and December 2015, we made sure that we focused on key events that were of interest to leaders. So during International Women's Day on the 8th of March in 2015, we had massive global campaigns. So what CIVICUS did was that we had applications. I'm so surprised that maybe none of you or most of your organizations were not aware. An organization could apply to CIVICUS and said, we want to carry out a campaign in our country across the world, 157 of them. In total, 31 million campaigns. So you decided what you wanted to do. CIVICUS did not inform you or direct you about what action you take. Some people decided to do skydiving with broad messages about wanting to send a message across. Others decided to do, community bike rides, like they rode on their bicycles trying to pass a message across. Just innovative ways that were supposed to get the attention of the government about specific issues. So during International Women's Day, we had campaigns around the globe that focused on women's rights. In the next SDGs, what do we want to see as far as women are concerned, and children in particular? So we had messages in that regard about what we wanted governments to do as far as the SDGs are concerned, but pertaining to the rights of women and children. In May was a critical juncture because then there were still negotiations about what the Sustainable Development Goals would look like. So we had, for the entire month of May, different campaigns, millions of them, passing out different messages about equality, struggles against poverty, and the relationship between inequality, climate change, and poverty. Those messages were passed across. During the G7 summit, when the group of 7 leaders met in Geneva, there was a massive concert. Remember I said most of these events were organized, or all of them were organized by partners themselves. We had no influence whatsoever over what they wanted to do. So during the G8 from June 7 to 8, there was a massive concert. It brought together about 5,000 citizens. Songs, poems. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia, actually spoke at that event. You had lots of youth. You had lots of representatives of organizations passing out the message that, hey, you are the richest leaders, or the leaders of the 7 richest countries. We want you to take seriously the needs and the aspirations of people in going to the September meetings in New York. During International Youth Day as well, the same message was passed across. So these days, when we talk about Women's Day, the theme was on women. When you talk about International Youth Day, the theme was on youth action. And then the big one, the negotiations and the drafting of the Sustainable Development Goals in Geneva. There were huge protests a few kilometers away from the UN building, but also thousands, I think about 220,000 events across the world, calling on leaders to know that citizens were watching them. And of course, climate change, the climate change conference on the 30th of on the 30th from the 30th of November to the 11th of December 2015. So this was the event in Germany, the concert that was held. After the concert, before the concert, these are some of the participants, and they had, placards and posters sending out their message to global leaders. In Uganda, the youth decided to ride their bikes and talk about youth power, passing through parliament, passing through strategic buildings where governments had no choice, or government representatives, but to see the message. And we hope the message got across. This was at the Constitution Hill here in Johannesburg. It was a dance group that decided to pass on their message through theater. And this was in Nepal. I don't think I would have wanted to do that, but that was how they thought their message could that's how they thought they could get their message across. And this was in Jakarta, ahead of the climate change conference in sorry?
Why is the person painted black?
Yeah, very sensitive. Very sensitive.
No, I'm not trying to spot something, but it sucks. You had a black face situation.
I think.
I was just like,
I see what you're saying, but I think it was his own way of getting the attention of, I'm painted black, and I think somebody must notice me in the midst of, yes.
He's like, that's fine.
Okay. And this was in Jakarta in Indonesia. Then that can spark a whole new debate in this place. So then this is in India, where they decided to pass on their own message through this. So what I want to say is that as an organization, we, as the previous session minutes. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Okay. How do I do this?
I think just go to the government.
To the government. All right.
The case studies.
Yeah.
Did the goals turn out?
Sorry?
Did the goals turn out?
Yes. And yeah, they turned out, and they had feedback from citizens. The challenge we're facing now is how we monitor them.
Yeah.
And how we make sure that they are implemented by our governments. But one of the projects CIVICUS has developed is called the Data Shift, and that focuses on citizens reporting about the goals. The Millennium Development Goals were quite, they had challenges. Why? Because at each reporting period, if you noticed, 2010 leaders realized it's 5 years to go before the end of the former goals, and everybody panicked and they started doing reports. We noticed that most of the reports done by governments were different from those done by citizens. So now what we want to do is for the next 15 years, citizens will report on each goal using whatever way works for them. Via cell phones, Twitter, whatever social media method they want. So we're trying to develop that project called Data Shift, where it's data collected by citizens themselves. I have like 3 other presentations to do, like topics, but one will be about citizens holding governments accountable. That's supposed to be the last one. I don't know if we'll have time for that, but I think what might interest all of us is comparing citizen movements in South Africa and those in other countries. And by a show of hands, I know a majority of you are based here in South Africa. Do we have colleagues from other countries? Please raise your hand, and where are you from?
Colleagues from
Other countries.
Sorry. I thought you mean people that you work with from other countries.
No,
Sorry.
I just want to know how many countries we have here. Yes. Canada, okay. Lesotho, yeah. Kenya, wow. So that's it? Yeah, so basically what we wanted to say was, these days there's so much repression in the streets when citizens go to protest. So now citizens are using alternative means. People are coming together, convening in their millions without necessarily meeting face to face. So they do that online. So you get a campaign and hashtag, and everybody tweets and everybody talks about it, and that gets the attention of the authorities. So that's just the point we're trying to make here. Now, let's look at the difference between civil society movements in South Africa and those in other countries. Now, all our constitutions, if you look at almost all constitutions in the world, you find that every constitution talks about our citizens have the right to speak, our citizens have the right to express themselves, our citizens have the right to convene, to meet, to assemble, our citizens have the right to associate. That to me, and as far as my experience is concerned, is deceptive. Because the Constitution preaches that. If you want to know how free a country really is, look at the laws, the legislation that get passed in Parliament. And those laws can tell you how free or not free a country is. Telda talked about the Uganda NGO bill. Now the government in Uganda realizes you have a very vibrant civil society community that talks about rights, that talk about freedoms. And so they know that, and these are formal civil society organizations that work on these issues. Now they decide to have a bill, which is now a law, that restricts these activities. Now it's a strategy from the government, and as civil society we're trying to see how we can anticipate such actions, and then we do away with them before they get materialized. Because once a bill becomes a law, it is very difficult to change the law, and it is very difficult for you to fight against that law. So in Uganda, what the government did last year was have a law that creates a board composed of government officials and 1 or 2 civil society representatives that has the power, the board now, to monitor the activities of civil society organizations. So if you, for example, criticize President Museveni, all of a sudden, an official from the board has the right to come into your office and check exactly what you're doing. So these are on paper, but what happens practically is very, very difficult for these organizations, because they will come today and say, okay, show us your accounts, for example. Then they look at, people make mistakes, and they may look at maybe an account that's not in line with perhaps a particular objective, and they say this organization has not been properly audited, so you have to close down. And that's it. Why? Because you criticize the government. So these are some of the laws that I say you look at and you know about how repressive a state is. In Ethiopia that we're talking about, what strategy the government used was that any organization that focuses on human rights broadly, on advocacy, on democracy, you can't receive more than 10% of your funding from international donors. How many Ethiopians can really contribute millions to fund an organization that will carry out these activities? Very few. So when that was done, most organizations had to close down. And now there's just one organization that focuses on human rights. How they raise their funds, I don't know. That's the strategy the government uses. Now, in Azerbaijan, in Mexico, in Russia, Pakistan, Venezuela, we see all of these laws being passed, similar laws. And it's like governments share notes. When one government passes that law, you see it's a ripple effect. Before you know it, most other governments are doing the same. Now the big one, South Africa. The history of this country has made activism to be very rich, to be very vibrant. You have a vibrant, civil society in South Africa based on the history and based on the fact that the current leaders were also part of this movement. I was in a meeting once, but now that has changed. Because when you get into government, the tendency is for you now to start behaving like those who are already there. I was in a meeting once, and a member of the ANC, with no offense to anybody who is a member of the ANC, actually stood up and castigated his colleague who was a member of a civil society organization and said, what all these protests you're having are not necessary. But I was like, you were doing the same pre-1990, and now that you're in power, you criticize these things. So South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And it's the only country that has a constitution that authorizes state departments to work with civil society and citizens to implement certain policies. Now, the law is one thing, but the implementation is a completely different thing. But it's still that one of those countries that encourages collaboration between civil society and the government. And I've never heard of a case where a particular organization is targeted in South Africa because they did one form of advocacy or the other. When it comes to freedom of assembly, the laws are very clear. They are liberal. They are there for all to see. They allow protests, as opposed to other countries where, if you look at Swaziland, if you look at Rwanda, if you look at, if you go out of Africa, Maldives, and most other countries around the world, you have, even in South Africa, you have to give permission 7 days before you have a protest. But the authorities have the prerogative of approving that application or not. In South Africa, very few protests get, turned down. Very few applications. They do from time to time, but it might be because of security reasons or the fact that the police feel they can't control what happens in the crowd. In other countries, governments use that to prevent protests from happening. So they'll say, we can't guarantee your safety. But then you notice that in a country like Rwanda, protests that are organized by the main party in power, in fact, the security forces, they guide the protests to make sure that they go and they happen very well. But if an opposition party organizes a protest, they are either rejected or they are forcefully dispersed. Can I just beg for 10 minutes to round up? So we thought all was well in South Africa as far as legislation was concerned until 2013, the Protection of State Information Bill was passed by Parliament and sent to the President for approval. The President had to send it back because there are certain clauses that need to be changed. But then the challenge about this law is that it's very ambiguous. So the law states that you are fined heavily, sometimes sent to prison. That's the first draft of the law, for revealing information the state considers secretive. The question we ask is, what kind of information does the state consider secretive? So if a bill like this, a law like this becomes law, if a law like this is enforced, that means if I write on Canva, I might face treason charges. Why? Because the government might argue that I am compromising the security of the president. That's how states operate. So a lot of action has gone in by civil society, and there's the Right to Know campaign taking on this law and saying it can't be passed. At the moment, it has been sent back to one committee from Parliament for major revisions by the president. I'll stop there for maybe questions, and I hope one of these days we'll have another opportunity to interact.
Okay.
No, sorry, she had, okay.
There was 3 outstanding
Sure.
from the committee in blue.
Okay, so we have 5 questions. Can I please ask any questions?
Thank you.
Very, very brief.
Yes.
And no dialogue. Yeah.
Okay, let me start with him. He's not spoken.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, as young people who want to make a difference,
Yes.
where do you think the power and opportunity lies?
Mhm.
Is it being one of the protesters outside, or is it being inside that room where you might be constrained but you still have a voice?
Yeah, I think that would depend on specific cases. You can look at that on a case-by-case basis. There are times when it's more effective to be out there, as dangerous as it might be sometimes. If the students who were protesting just sat in the room and tried to talk to officials, most of us would not be aware, who are not students, about the difficulties they faced. So my answer to you is, there are times when it's good to go out there, but there are also times when it's good to speak to those in power and engage with them on a one-on-one basis. And that's why we facilitate engagements at the UN, in Geneva and in New York, because one of our roles is to create that space. As an individual, you might not have the legitimacy, but the privilege to just walk up to somebody in the UN and speak to them. But because we have ECOSOC status, we facilitate those meetings. But I think one of the issues which our leaders are trying to rectify now is to get the voices of the youth. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't listen. But to answer your question, look at it on a case-by-case basis, when it's more effective to do both or to do either of the two. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate you on the work that you are doing, and you were very much informed. Another thing is, it seems like an interesting organization to work for. So us as graduates and wanting to get into a space like that, what is the procedures that we have to follow, and we have to have a specific degree or just an interest?
You just have to have an interest in civil society issues, but I think there are specific projects that require specific qualifications. But anything social sciences, as long as you prove that you can do what is required, because as an organization, I mean, you listen to Telda, she's very qualified. We want people who can do. Where do you study?
Experts, but I come from a commerce background.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Yeah, I just try to understand, like, for instance, maybe I want to get into commerce, but still have an interest in this. How do you go about it?
So we have internships. We have a partnership with Wits University. From time to time, they send interns to. I'll give you my details, and then we can communicate. Those opportunities arise for interns to come and work. And I started as an intern, and now I'm who I am. So. Yes, sir.
Just my question is a quick one.
Yes.
Looking back at the time when you guys started in '93,
in the back. Yeah.
Looking at the time when you started in '93 as an organization,
Yes.
current right now, it is 2016.
Yes.
Probably, I think it's
23, 24, 24, yeah, thereabout.
Now, looking at the space between that, I think when you started, just assuming, I think when you started with a lot of challenges, right?
Yeah.
But now that you are here, and probably there's also a lot of improvement and a lot of achievement that you have made. What do you foresee as in for future? Let's say maybe for the next 24 years, next 23 years, what can you calculate and what do you predict?
Yeah. My honest prediction is that for the next 25 years, our structures may be dismantled. Yes. Because I think citizens will be more effective using social media and other kinds of communication mechanisms that are more effective. So it may be like that. It may be that we downsize. Because at the moment, a lot of things are happening outside of the confines of the four walls of an office. So you have the Arab Spring, for example, that was to a certain extent successful in bringing down dictators, but people did not sit in offices writing reports. They were in the streets and they were demonstrating and were using social media. So my fear is that in the next 24 years, I know I'll still be alive, but if I don't get another job, I'll be told that there's no space for me anymore, because the world is changing so quickly that you have, and the governments are becoming more restrictive. So they may target specific organizations. It might be more comfortable working from your bedroom than going to an office. So, yes, sir. Okay. Last question.
Actually, in terms of the SDGs, right?
Yes.
It's like 17 goals. It actually comes up with those goals and says, this is what you're going to focus on. Because if you look at goal 10,
yes,
and goal, I think 16, 15.
16.
15.
Yes.
The one which talks about climate preservation.
Yeah, 15.
And you look at goal number 10, which talks about creating, reducing inequalities within countries and regions. So to me, it kind of like, it's contradictory because countries like the USA, which is in the Security Council, those are countries which practice inequalities. And you look at goal 15, which talks about preserving our environment, and you find China, which is just polluting the world left, right, and center. So it's like, where are we going now? Are these goals just there for the sake of, that like they look like they're doing something?
Yeah.
Whereas in terms of delivery, there's actually nothing which is being done.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, and this is final. I think you are spot on, right? And it speaks to his question about us looking for solutions ourselves. Because the US, for example, has refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol, and China, and these are the these are the greatest polluters. And then they come and sit. So we are fighting a battle that may already be lost, and that's the power dynamics that we have to contend with. Our State of Civil Society report a couple of years ago focused on these issues, the interplay of the big countries and how they make decisions that affect. So, but with these goals, I have been part of the process from the outset. What I find solace in is that these goals, there were lots of consultations that happened prior to the development of the goals. You had a committee headed by an African from Kenya that had the draft, and then citizens from diverse backgrounds provided input. What we saw as the final set of goals has lots of input from citizens. But then when it comes to making decisions and when it comes to having accountability, I think we are in a world where the big powers still have their say and their way in whatever they do. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, this is so engaging, and thank you so much for coming through. And for it's always a very good sign when we go over time and we have a lot of engagement and a lot of questions. So thank you so much. I'll give it over to Ditonela to give the vote.
Thank you for having us.
First of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to come and speak to us and come answer our questions. I think we've all gained tremendously from your presentation. And also just thank you so much for the preparation that went into all the information that you've given us, and also engaging us on issues which we feel very passionately about. So thank you so much for that. And I'm sure that a lot of us will be very much in touch with you in terms of working with you in terms of curbing a lot of our socioeconomic issues in this continent, also abroad. So thank you so much for taking the time.
I have a few business cards in the car. I'll share with you. Please get in touch. And I think what will make this meeting successful for us, not just that you have been very active and we're happy to be here, but also that you join CIVICUS as new members so that you continue.